All right, folks. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I am really excited to have Andy Sales with us tonight. It is 7 a.m., Andy?
Yeah, I can't complain. It's 7 a.m. Yeah.
7 a.m. Well, there's nothing. Although apparently I managed to wake Andy at 5 a.m. this morning. And I mean, who has their Slack on at 5 o'clock in the morning? That can't possibly be my fault. I'm just going to go with, Andy really should needs to think about his snooze function on his phone. Anyway, that aside, I don't even know how long I've known Andy now. I knew him before he joined Scaled Agile. He was one of the handful of safe folks I knew in the UK. And then one day he turned up at Scaled Agile. And I don't know, we've kind of bantered ever since about various Scaled Agile things that interest us. One of the things that we noticed from chatting with all of you is that metrics is always a hot topic. And Andy was the primary author of the update to the metrics article on the SAFe framework, which took place some point in the last year. Not quite a year ago, I don't think, but some point in the last year, or the very long year that we call 2021 is kind of just that big, long, extended period in which there is no sense of time. So somewhere in there was an update to the metrics article. So in my various backwards and forwards with Andy on various things, I said, would you come and chat to some Aussies and some folks who like to hang out with Aussies about the changes that you've made, because everyone's really curious. So without further ado, Andy, thank you very much for joining us, and they are all yours. Usual drill, folks. I'll open up the chat, which I forgot to do. Just drop your questions in chat, and Andy's going to run through his spiel. We'll try to cover anything key as he comes through, and we'll do a Q&A at the end.
Yeah, thanks for that setup, Em. That's great. Can you just see my slides? Just let me know you can see them.
We can.
And just like Em was saying, metrics, I think, is one of the things that comes up again and again when we speak to customers. They really want to know how they can measure the efforts and the investments they're making in this journey they're on. And sometimes they're struggling greatly to think about how do they balance measuring outcomes, how do they balance measuring whether they're improving their ways of working. So I think it was maybe February, Em, that we put the new article out. And I've got a few slides here, maybe, 25 minutes, just to run you through some of the major changes of the articles. And then hopefully we can get in some good Q&A about what drove those changes and about how you can think about maybe rolling this out in your circumstances. So let me jump in. Em did a great introduction, so I won't say too much more. I've been with Scaled Agile for 3 years, work as part of the framework team. And as well as the metrics piece, I think you and I, Em, have been doing a lot of work around the assessments this year as well. So always a pleasure to pair together and work together when we get the chance. So with SAFe 5, when we released it last year, or a little before, we had the goal of business agility. And we defined that goal as the ability for organizations to compete and thrive in the digital age by quickly responding to market changes and emerging opportunities with innovative business solutions. So this is the goal that all enterprises that are implementing SAFe are striving to achieve. What they need, though, to help them reach that goal successfully is to make the right decisions at the right time on this journey to make sure they're constantly adapting and changing as the market around them also changes. So what they need to do that, of course, is information and data. And that's really where the metrics come in, helping organizations to navigate this journey they're on successfully and get the outcomes that they're striving to achieve. Now, if you remember back prior to this new update to the metrics article, the previous article in SAFe was more a collection of things that you might measure. It was a huge article, link after link after link, things that you might measure at the team level, across the art, across the portfolio. But what it didn't have was any coherent measurement model. It was just a set of things that you might consider adding to those that you're measuring. So what we did earlier this year is we took a bit of time to go back and think about what is it that's important when you start thinking about measuring the progress you're making towards business agility. And what you're looking at on the slide here is the resultant model, a simple yet comprehensive measurement model that considers 3 measurement domains: outcomes, competency, and flow. And the way that we arrived at those 3 domains was to take a step back and think about what are all the steps an organization needs to go through to start with an emergent business opportunity, to sense that opportunity, to realize it, to test the market, to eventually deliver it until they leverage that business opportunity. And when you think about this value stream of steps they need to do to be successful with business agility, then these three measurement domains start to emerge quite naturally. They need to measure outcomes. Are we meeting the needs of our business and customers with the solutions that we're producing? We need to measure flow. Are we effectively increasing the efficiency of these steps so we can deliver the value more quickly? And we need to measure competency. Are we actually improving the lean agile practices that are required for us to efficiently and effectively achieve business agility? The nice thing about this model, and at least some of the feedback that we've had as well, is not only is it nice and simple, but it's also applicable at each level of the framework. So you can think about what it means to measure flow, outcomes, or competency at a team level. You can do the same across an agile release train, a solution train, or even a portfolio. And what I've tried to do in the slides that I've got is just illustrate how you might measure those different things at different levels and what it really means to think about outcomes within a team, for example, maybe using the PI objectives as a way of capturing that, compared to thinking about outcomes at a portfolio where we're thinking about things like OKRs and KPIs. At the end of the talk, what I've got is a dashboard where I've brought together some examples of how you might instantiate these metrics at all different levels. And again, I hope that will help really to bring it to life as well. So what I thought I'd do, if it's okay, is just quickly run through each of the measurement domains. So we'll have a look about what we mean by outcomes. We'll have a look at how we measure flow, and then we'll have a look at how we measure competency as well. Now, I think whenever I talk to individuals about metrics, outcomes perhaps is the one that they struggle the most with. They seem to have the ability to measure whether our processes are becoming more efficient or whether people are improving their ways of working. But how do we actually connect the work we do with the business outcomes that we're striving to achieve? We've actually had a lot of guidance around outcomes in the framework for quite some time. And if we start by thinking about how do we measure outcomes at the portfolio level, one thing we need to remind ourselves, of course, is what a safe portfolio does. So a safe portfolio governs a set of development value streams. And each of these development value streams produces one or multiple solutions. So in other words, the portfolio is governing a solution set. And what we need to think about when we measure outcomes across the portfolio is what are the outcomes that those development value streams should be striving to achieve. And of course, those development value streams contain all the people doing the work in our agile release trains. And typically what we say is that we need to derive those outcome metrics from two sources. The first source is due to the nature of the work that the operational value streams for which those development value streams are building the solutions actually does. So what I mean by that is every development value stream develops a solution for one of two purposes, either for our operational value streams to sell to our customers directly. Maybe we're producing a software product or a cyber physical device, or the development value stream is producing a solution, a system most likely, which the operational value stream uses to actually carry out their work. And because of that, what it means that the development value stream should inherit the objectives and outcomes that those operational value streams need to achieve to say they're being successful. So if we're supporting, on the slide here, an operational value stream that sells a software product to their customer, we also need to be judged on things like acquisition, activation, revenue. If the operational value stream that we support is one that provides a service, the fulfillment example that you see in the second row, then things like net promoter score or conversion rates are the things that we need to measure. But the short answer here is that every development value stream needs to ask itself the question, what operational activities are we trying to improve and how would they measure their success? And that becomes one part of how we're going to measure outcomes as well. And then the second source of outcome metrics for the development value stream across the portfolio are the strategic themes. So every safe portfolio, of course, has a set of strategic themes, often represented in the OKR format that you see on the slide here, one objective, 3 to 5 key results, and those also directly feed into the outcomes that the portfolio is measuring itself against. So the combination of the key results attached to our strategic themes and the combination of the work that the operational value stream does is the source for us to define these outcomes that we need to clearly strive to achieve. And if we're not moving the needle in that direction, something's going wrong with the solution development that we're doing. And then, of course, the nice thing about thinking about it like that is that when you reflect on how we measure outcomes across the rest of the framework, you start to see this nice connection between strategy and execution. So if at the portfolio level we have clear outcomes defined, we know that we can express those outcomes through events like PI planning to the teams on the art, and they can make sure that their PI objectives, which is the key mechanism within SAFe for teams and arts to define outcomes, start to align to that strategy. It's not mandatory, of course, that teams have iteration goals, but many of them do choose to do that in SAFe. And again, that's our primary mechanism to define outcomes across a 2-week iteration within the teams. So by doing this, we get this nice set of outcomes at each level, and we start to get this nice connection between strategy and execution, driving alignment across the whole portfolio. So that really describes the outcome piece. And of course, all of these require some analytical work to actually go out and think about how you're going to identify the different metrics, but particularly around the outcomes, there are some good guidance out there to help you think about what type of operational work you do and what type of outcomes you need. Now, the second measurement domain is flow. And here we took a decision earlier this year to actually incorporate the flow framework from Mick Kirsten. And I'm sure a lot of you have been aware of Mick's work. You've probably read the book From Project to Product. And you know also that in the SAFe courses, we reference the work of Mick, excuse me, to quite some extent. And we've been heavily influenced by some of the thought leadership that he's provided. One of the things he often talks about in his books is that the challenge that organizations currently face is that if they don't master large-scale software development, as it says on the slide here, they're really at risk of becoming a digital relic. They're going to fall behind. It's going to be impossible for them to compete with organizations like the FANGs. And what he provides in the book is a flow framework, a set of flow metrics that help organizations really measure how effective and efficient they are at mastering some of these large-scale development practices. And that's what we've chosen to incorporate into the framework, with one exception, and I'll highlight that when I get to it. So Mick defines 5 flow metrics. He starts with flow distribution. And one of the things to think about as I go through these is, again, they're applicable at all different levels. So flow distribution, of course, is a critical measure. It helps measure the different types of work in the system at any one time. The example on this slide is measuring across an agile release train. What is the balance of new features delivering real business value versus things like enablers, things we need to do to maintain the health of the solution, knowing that if we get the balance wrong in one or other directions, we're either going to end up with something that is hard to update and increment, or we're going to end up stifling any new value being delivered to our customers. But equally, we could apply this at the portfolio level. What is the balance of enabler epics versus new business epics? Or maybe a team wishes to measure their flow distribution across one PI to see if they're allocating enough capacity to things like maintenance and refactoring. But this is a really critical metric. What is the type of work we do? And does the distribution match the aspirations we have in terms of balancing the work that's going through the system? The second one he talks about is very familiar to us, flow velocity. It's really just a measure of throughput. The most common place to measure this, of course, is in the team. Teams want to understand, are the efforts that we're making to improve our processes really improving our velocity? You can certainly see an upward trend on this slide here. It looks like this team is making some good changes, likely things coming out of their retrospective, but also teams are striving for predictability. They want to move away from this regular up-down velocity. They want something that's stabilized. And again, this team looks like it's done a good job to stabilize its throughput. That's going to help them enormously when they start to think about how much work we can deliver over a certain period of time. Flow time is the next one that Mick talks about. And one little bit of interpretation here, when we think about flow time, in SAFe, we like to think about flow time from when the work begins and enters the system all the way through to when it's released. In SAFe, the continuous delivery pipeline includes activities like continuous exploration. But the way that we use flow time means that if you want to measure flow time for a specific part of that flow, maybe from integration to deployment, that's absolutely fine as well. So we like to use this flow time fairly flexibly, just being clear about what are the start and end parameters that we're measuring it for. And of course, flow time is particularly useful. We can see here the flow time, and we can see, although most features are being completed fairly quickly, or at least not taking more than a PI, there are some outliers here, features that are definitely taking more than a PI to complete, and those would warrant further investigation. And of course, flow time is characterized by cost of delay. The longer it takes us to complete something, the greater the cost of delay that we're incurring. So this can be a very useful visualization to help understand why some things are taking so long to get through the system. And then his penultimate flow metric is flow load. And of course, you know, within SAFe or any system of work, if we don't manage the load of the system through things like working process limits, managing our queues, keeping batches small, it's very easy for the system to become overloaded. And of course, the best way to measure flow load is a cumulative flow diagram showing how much work is in every single state at any point in time. And on this diagram, I've also added the arrival curve. What is the rate, the gradient that work is entering the system, and what is the gradient of the departure curve? How quickly is it leaving? Anytime the arrival curve is steeper than the departure curve, we know the system is filling up with work, and eventually we're going to become overloaded. So that's a nice leading indicator for us to address, making sure that we don't let that problem manifest itself and think about how we can actually manage our queues and reduce the amount of work in the system. This is a great metric also to use across things like the portfolio level as well. How many epics do we have in flight? How much effort are we putting into analyzing new business cases? How much work are we really getting through the portfolio Kanban and realizing as value we're delivering to our customers? And then the final one that Mick talks about is flow efficiency. And in some ways, of course, this one is almost at a slightly different level to the others because it relies on some of those other metrics to really clarify it clearly. The great thing about flow efficiency is it's going to ask people who are measuring this to carry out a value stream mapping activity, to look at their workflow, to describe all the steps in that particular workflow, and then measure how much time they're spending on each step actually adding value. How much time do we spend working on this particular feature that's moving through these steps versus how long does this feature sit waiting for someone to work on it, either because they're blocked or there's something ahead of it in the queue. And the nice thing about flow efficiency is it's a great way to really grab the attention of senior leadership, because what we'll find in most organizations is the flow efficiency calculation, the total active time, the total value added time over the total flow time is often a single digit result. A flow efficiency of 8% is not uncommon. And of course, that highlights huge amounts of waste and delay in the system, which itself results in financial impact, loss of value to the customer, delays in releases and things like that. So this is certainly one that we recommend people get started with, of course, to try and build some of that urgency for change as well. And then in addition to that, we added one flow metric. So it's a 5+1 model. And the one we added, of course, was flow predictability. So all of you will be familiar with the program predictability measure. It helps us understand at the end of the PI how predictable the teams are in meeting their commitments, and therefore how predictable is the whole Agile release train in meeting its commitments when we look at the aggregation across the teams. And simply what we're doing, of course, is we're taking the planned business value we had at the beginning of the PI and working with our business owners, reflecting on how much of that business value we've delivered at the end of the PI. This used to be, and I guess it still is in some ways, the one mandatory metric that we have in SAFe. And what I mean by that is that predictability means everything to us and our leaders. We're trying to get to a place where we can make and meet our commitments with our customers and business stakeholders reliably. As once we have that, then we can start to put our foot on the gas and really think about how we can improve our processes. If we do it the other way around, and we start by thinking about how we can get faster before we have predictability in place, it becomes very difficult actually to maintain this predictable delivery engine. And of course, that becomes difficult once you start missing commitments to get the support we need for this way of working. So a quick look at the flow metrics. And now what I want to do is have a look at the third measurement domain, which is how we measure competency. And I've got a cold, so you have to excuse me from time to time. So remember, we've measured outcomes. Are we meeting the business and customer needs? We're going to measure flow. Are we actually improving the efficiency of all the steps in our process? And then the last thing we need to measure is how competent are we at these lean agile practices that are needed to really succeed with business agility. how we measure that is through the SAFe core competencies. So within SAFe 5, of course, we have 7 core competencies. You can see them on the slide here. And what we say within SAFe is that some level of proficiency or expertise within each one is really required for the organization to effectively achieve business agility. So the question then becomes, how do we measure how effective we are at these different core competencies? And the answer to that is through the SAFe assessments. And what we have, if you haven't seen them before, is 8 SAFe assessments. The first one is the business agility assessment, which is the broad understanding of how are we progressing as a portfolio towards our goal of business agility. So this assessment will measure across all 7 core competencies to a lesser extent than the ones I'm going to show you in a minute, but enough to give you a broad understanding of where are we on our journey and where are the areas we may want to invest further in. So you can see, for example, on this slide, that one area that's scoring particularly low is lean portfolio management. That might be something that we want to investigate further and even think about making some investments in. One of the things that Em helped us with earlier this year is some updates to the business agility assessment. And just very quickly, I wanted to mention those because one problem we had previously was that, although I think Em wants me to add some of the terminology back in, but one problem we had previously was that we had very heavy reliance on SAFe terminology. And that was really a barrier to people using this assessment until they'd gone through the full raft of SAFe training. What we've done now is really simplify the assessment. We've removed all the specific SAFe terminology, and this now becomes a great tool that you can use really early on in the journey, even before you start implementing SAFe if you want, to build some of that urgency for change and highlight some of the areas that you might want to improve in. So some nice updates to try and make this a little bit more accessible. The real kicker here, though, is where do we get the opportunities for improvement? And coupled with the business agility assessment, we have 7 core competency assessments. And the purpose of these then is to deep dive into the area that you may want to consider applying some improvements to. So if lean portfolio management is an area that looks like it's struggling broadly because of the results of the business agility assessment, running the lean portfolio management core competency assessment is a great way to get that additional fidelity you need to actually understand how you need to take action to get better. And there's one of these for each of the 7 core competencies. What we're seeing is that people are running these on a cadence. So maybe every other PI, they're running the business agility assessment. Maybe the teams are running the team assessment, every other PI. Maybe the art is using the APD assessment as input to the inspect and adapt. They're meant to be flexible for you to use them how you want to, but just know there's a toolkit that you can download to provide you a set of slides to run a workshop to help you navigate the steps, to facilitate them, to analyze the results, and then to think about some of the improvement activities. And all these assessments are available through Comparative Agility and Agility Health on the SAFe community platform for all community members to use free of charge, of course. Just wanted to put one slide in here as a sneak peek on something that's coming out in the next week or so. We've been putting a lot of work into the growth recommendations side of the assessments as well. And next week, we're going to launch a set of growth recommendations, 170 interventions, actions that teams can take, coupled to the team and technical agility assessment. So what this means is you'll be able to go into either of the assessment partners, do the assessment, and for each statement where you've scored low, you'll see a set of recommended steps that you may choose to action with some links and activities that will help you improve proficiency in that particular area. So once that's out, of course, I'll let people know. It would be great to get some feedback on how that's going down. So let me just wrap up and say a few things in summary and about how this works in practice. Now, this is the slide I wanted to mention, and I just mentioned briefly at the beginning. A couple of really important things to say about this slide. So if we look at this slide and imagine that this is a dashboard for an enterprise, an organization using SAFe, what we're trying to say with this new guidance and what's been working very well with the customers we've been using it with is that you don't have to measure everything at every level. So although I showed you 6 flow metrics, I showed you all the assessments, I showed you the outcomes, what you need to think about is which parts of that do we need to measure at which level to help us make better decisions. What we are encouraging people to do is try and have an outcome, a flow, and a competency metric at each level of the portfolio. So the teams should be measuring outcomes in some way. They typically are. They're typically using their PI objectives for that. They should have a measure of flow. This team is clearly chosen to measure flow velocity and flow distribution. and they should have a way of measuring their competency. And of course, they can do that through the team and technical agility assessment. So that's one thing. What is the instantiation of each of those categories at each level? The second thing that's really important on this slide is we're trying to get organizations away from this idea of rolling up metrics. And instead, what we're getting them to do is measure at each level separately, or instead of rather, to just rolling up data from one level to another. So what I mean by that is if you want to measure something like outcomes at the portfolio level, you're not just rolling up the objectives at the team and the art level, you're thinking very deeply about how do we define those KPIs that the portfolio needs to achieve. Or if you're trying to measure something like flow distribution at the portfolio level, that's not a summation of all the teams, that's a completely separate metric that looks across all our epics and understands the balance of work. So that's the second thing, is to really try and get away from this roll up that I think can be very challenging and doesn't necessarily give us the insight we need. And then the third thing, of course, to say is that the metrics that I presented today are not meant to be exhaustive. You can see on this slide in the top left corner, they're also measuring employee net promoter score. That's an outcome metric for this organization. It wasn't something I presented, but there's absolutely no reason, in fact, it's desirable for organizations to think about what other measures and metrics do they want to add to these categories as well. And that's completely fine. Now, one of the things we got in terms of feedback when we were developing the new IP, of course, is there is some nervousness around implementing metrics and the effect that it has on behaviors and things like that. So in the article, we also included some success factors, and I'll just quickly talk through them. The first one is really to make sure that we're using measurement in conjunction with other discovery tools. And what that means is that while the number is important to highlight something that we need to do, we need to make sure we take the time to go and visit that team, talk to those individuals or stakeholders, actually go and see what the problem is before we take the necessary corrective action. The number on its own won't give us the information we need to make the best next steps. The second one, we're being really tough on, apply metrics where they support improved decision-making. I think my experience, and probably yours as well, is when we lack the understanding on what to measure, we end up measuring too much. And collecting the metrics becomes a burden, and actually we get overwhelmed with the number of things we're trying to measure. So what we're saying to organizations is, ask yourself a simple question. What decisions will be improved if we add this metric to our scorecard? And if there is nothing, we don't need to add it. If there is, the second question becomes, do we need to make these decisions now, or can we delay the addition of this metric? And then, of course, once the metrics stop serving the purpose they were designed for, we remove them from the scorecard and reduce the burden on ourselves in collecting them. Number 3 is very familiar. Just be careful of the effect on behaviors. We don't want to tie metrics to things like compensation plans or incentives. We don't want the achievement of the metric to become the goal in itself. If it does, we can guarantee that the teams will achieve the metric. And also you'll start to see things like a blame culture appearing, where one team misses the metric, they start accusing another team of perhaps missing their deadline or the deliverable, something that might have been out of their control. But we get into a very ugly situation sometimes where the achievement of the number becomes the goal in itself. And then number 4, and perhaps one of the most important ones, is we need to be very careful on how we interpret these metrics. One of the reasons that we have the 3 measurement domains is to try and balance some of the misunderstanding that might occur if, for example, you were improving your flow efficiency, reducing your flow time, looks like you're making wonderful strides, but actually if the outcome metrics are going down, it just means that you're delivering less valuable stuff more quickly. So we've got to make sure we combine all 3 measurement domains when we take a decision or a position about whether we really are improving. And then, of course, I just put an obligatory quote up at the end, but I do like this quote from HBR last year because it touches on the culture piece. So if we really want to be successful with using metrics like these to drive some of the decisions in our company, we need to develop the culture that's going to support that. And of course, that starts with leadership. So we need leaders to really help us support this change in practices, support these change in habits. We want them to start talking the talk and showing how we can actually illustrate some of the decisions we're taking in the data and how we can use that data for a really positive effect, not least to also celebrate all the successes we've been making on our safe journey. So I didn't want to spend too long on the slides. I hope it wasn't too quick, but looking forward to getting to the Q&A. And Em, with that, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was I thought that was great. folks, I know you're all many of you are forever asking me questions about metrics. This is my great opportunity to let you ask somebody else. But I'm here to add my 2 cents as well, as is Adrian, if that is useful. If I might just get you to you can either drop your question in the chat, or you can just raise your hand so you don't all talk at once and we have some sense of order to the question asking. So just the raise hand function in Zoom, or I guess you can wave at us. That will work as well.
I might just make a comment if I can. I love the updates. I think they're so good, making it a bit more simple. And I really like the addition of the competency. It's one of the ones that I've seen just gets forgotten about. You know, it's all about this efficiency and cycle time and all this kind of stuff. And the business always wants a measure to just say, tell me we're doing better. I just want one metric to tell me we're doing better. And I always found the competency one dropped off. So to actually have that as one of the key ones, I think really helps out and have those conversations around competency, which, you know, unfortunately and strangely get forgotten about. So that's great.
Thanks, Richard. No, it's great to hear. Really good.
So I'll say something. I actually ran a measure and grow workshop last Friday for TTA and CLC. And what I found, especially with the CLC assessment, and for those who might not be familiar, it's continuous learning culture, is that the innovation section got quite emotional. And what we use is a product called Mentimeter, and we have the results shown up on the screen in real time. It's a fantastic tool, by the way, if anyone does not use it. But I found that there's a lot of emotion that came out of it, and people were more or less complaining about things rather than coming up with suggestions. How would you deal with that when you're getting people just using it as a bitch fest in a way?
Tell me, Andrew, how did you run it? Was it in a workshop setting, or was it something you were sending out to individuals? How did you do it?
It was a workshop setting, and what we do is we load the questions into Mentimeter, and they use their mobile phones to record the response, and it puts the result in real time up on the screen. Yeah, and then we talk about what are the pain points, and then they really zoom in and focus on some of the areas that, you know, perhaps leadership weren't providing enough time for innovation. That was one of the areas that came up.
Yeah, I do exactly the same thing. I guess when I think about the assessments, I think about them in 2 ways. So number one, of course, the number that you get out is important because it highlights areas that you want to improve in. But I must say, actually, for me, it's the conversations that we drive through doing the assessment process that is most enlightening. I suppose if it was getting to the point where people were challenging to focus on improvement items because they just wanted to moan and complain, that's where the data helps us, because we can focus them in on what are the 5 statements that we have the greatest opportunities. Let's pick those off and just focus on those. But I'm also mindful of not rushing those conversations, because I bet people were unloading for the first time in a while, right? And you were getting some real emotions that maybe have been bottled up, and this was the first time to express it. So I think if I was in your stage, I would have actually just maybe put in another workshop to let them continue. It's important that people get that off their plate to some extent. But it doesn't need to become a blame thing, right? And as long as it remains objective, I think it's valuable. But I think it's just getting them to focus on what are the top 5 areas to improve on, you know, honing on that. But yeah, interesting.
There's quite some probing questions in there.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, we've been going through the assessments recently, improving them. We started with the TTA and we'll eventually get to all the others. And there are some questions that are very direct as well. And obviously some questions, the responsibility for effectively delivering that outcome or whatever it is, falls squarely with 1 or 2 people. And if we're not careful, it does become, you know, this person hasn't done this person hasn't done that. Which is why I like to do in the workshop format, because if we just send out the survey, we don't get all this added information around how people actually feel, of course.
Awesome, thank you.
Richard's stolen my question as well. Great question.
In the chat there, and what advice have you got when initially launching SAFE and the business wants a metric to justify the investment in going agile? Why is this better than waterfall? Well, clearly the answer is 42 and the question doesn't matter.
I had this question the other day, or something similar. Someone listened to the whole of my presentation and said, right, now just give us the 2 or 3 metrics we have to measure. So if I was to boil down that last slide, the one where I had the dashboard, the things that I would start with, if we really want to have something to show the progress we're making, is for the competency piece, the business agility assessment is great because it's going to give us some broad understanding that we are improving how we're working. Across the art, I would have 2 measures, if you made me minimize them. One would be the predictability piece. We've got to get more predictable in our delivery. And then secondly, the flow efficiency. Are we improving the system of work? If the system of work is not improving, all the efforts we're making are fairly much not going anywhere. And then the third one is the KPIs. So at some point, someone's going to say, yes, we can see that you're getting better at the practices. Yes, we can see that you're improving the system of work, but are we actually improving the outcomes that the business is delivering? The KPIs that I talked about is probably most commonly the thing that's missing. If we're not delivering better outcomes using SAFe, well, then there's no argument for doing SAFe. I mean, there's other arguments like employee motivation and joy of work and stuff, but we've got to be improving outcomes. So I would measure the KPIs, the business agility assessment for competency, and then predictability and flow efficiency. That would be a great 4 to start with. And those are things, bar the predictability maybe, that you can do a compare and contrast with for now and the new way of working. So that's what I would start with.
One of the questions we've been asked is, tell us why this approach is better or than traditional methods that we're using. Have you seen these measures be applied to traditional projects as a point of comparison, or have you seen other analysis that's done to point to the benefits of these measures?
Yeah, I mean, things like flow efficiency, I was talking to someone the other day because what they wanted to do was measure flow efficiency today, and then of course measure it in the future. Now, we may not be working with features as such today, or at least not in the way that SAFe describes them, but we all know what making a change looks like to a system. So there's no reason we can't start today and say that change that we did to the solution that we updated a few months ago, what did that look like when it passed through the system of work and how inefficient was that? And then we can do the same comparison in a few months or a year once we start implementing SAFe. I think the biggest problem people have, Quinton, is that they don't have baseline numbers, right? And that really hurts them a year down the road when they've got nothing to compare it to. So if you take a snapshot today, measure the efficiency, the outcomes, and where we are with the business agility assessment, then trending that data in the future becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, good advice.
And
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you can do it with the work and the way we do it today. Yeah.
I might just add to that. It was almost a rhetorical question from my perspective. I just wanted to hear back what I'd already thought. But around the actual metrics and flow efficiency, the challenge is that you break the work down differently. So like, traditional work breakdown structures and things like that, putting them into features. And I look at it from particularly at flow metric stuff that you measure, and then you measure now like your baseline. And then when you start applying continuous improvement, you see what it does to the needle. But that's a challenge to tell that story, because often the people you're trying to convince don't quite get it, and sort of spending the time, having the time to be able to explain that, if that makes sense. Like, we're breaking work into features now, they're vertically sliced, we didn't normally do that, that sort of conversation, it's quite hard to have with the right people, the business owners.
Yeah, but what I would say on that, you're right, but what I would say on that is a system has a flow efficiency attributed to it, regardless of the work that's passing through it. So if the flow efficiency of the system at the moment is 7%, and then you, by breaking work down into features and doing nothing else, small batches, increase that flow efficiency to 15%, no one's going to argue about how we define the work differently. Well, I'd hope they wouldn't. They just recognize that you found a better way to describe the work that moves through the system quicker. I think the flow efficiency, because it's simply a percentage, regardless of the work that's passing through, gives us a good comparison. And we could take something like a release. How easy was it to release last time we released? Very difficult. 92% waste in the system. How easy was it this time? Much better. Well, your release is smaller. Well, yes, but that's one of the steps I took to improve the release capability. The other thing also, Richard, is that I've seen successfully people start to apply some financial metrics to these numbers. And what I mean by that is, if we have a flow efficiency that's very low or a flow time that is very high, actually by doing some simple calculations to ask ourselves, what is the cost of delay? What is the financial impact of releasing 1 month later than we thought we were going to do? That's the best way to get people's attention on these numbers, because suddenly flow efficiency from 10 to 20 isn't just an increase in 10%, it's a reduction in X thousand million dollars, whatever it is, and something that's very tangible. So there's ways we can grab their attention as well, which is helpful, I think.
Yeah, it's great advice. Thanks, Andrew.
Another question in the chat, Andy. This one's from Peter. Flow time into the system, delivered to the customer. Is that put into production for the customer to use, or when you can actually see the customer actually using it?
So this is an interesting question, because this is something we've debated a long time, and we do debate things like this a long time. So if you look at the flow time measure, how Mick describes it, it's described in a couple of different ways depending which source you read. Sometimes he talks about the work entering the workflow or entering the system. Sounds to me like he means a feature is pulled into implementation, and then he certainly talks about it being released through to the customer. So in that sense, it's when the work starts all the way through to when it's delivered to the customer. Now that gives us a few challenges in SAFe, because we also like to measure across the entire continuous delivery pipeline, which includes continuous exploration. We also have in SAFe previously talked about lead time, and we want to make sure we're not ending up with this confusing situation where there's lead time, there's flow time, there's cycle time. So what we're starting to narrow down on now is a single measure called flow time. Flow time can measure whatever portion of the system you want. So if I was to say to you, I'm going to measure total flow time, it would be from when an idea starts in the continuous exploration all the way through to when we release it. If I said to you, I want to measure flow time from implementation through to release, that makes total sense as well. So we're trying to use it in a very flexible way. And adjacent to that, it also means that you can say things like, what is our total flow efficiency? Or what is our flow efficiency of our release process? Or what is the flow efficiency from build to deployment? So we're trying to avoid a single definition of flow time and really just describe it as the length of time it takes for work to move through a workflow. And then it's up to you to determine what that workflow is based on how you're using the metric. Hope that helps.
Other questions, folks? They're never this quiet, Andy. This is clearly for your benefit.
You're feeling sorry for me. Am I cold?
That could be it. And we did say it was 7 a.m. and none of these guys would be chatty at 7 a.m. I can tell you that too.
This is a good warm up for my training.
I might just make another comment more than anything around metrics as an RTE. You've really got to understand them. And sometimes that takes a lot of effort. Like we're starting to apply Power BI, things like that to Azure DevOps. And unless you really understand how they're being calculated and the ins and outs, you can get yourself into trouble. So that's one piece of advice for any RTEs or anyone looking at metrics is make sure you actually understand how that thing's calculated, because you look like an absolute idiot if you're reporting on something only for someone else to go, oh, are you doing that? And you go, ooh, you know, so you really need to put the effort in. And that's not an easy task. There's a lot of time and energy spent to understand, particularly when you're pulling that data out. So just be a bit careful.
Richard, I saw yesterday, I won't be able to do this justice, but I'll do my best. Imbar posted a comic, like a little snippet from a comic in our Slack, and it was this massive dashboard of different metrics. And someone pointed out, what's this metric in the bottom right that's going down? And he said, that's our understanding of the other metrics on the dashboard. It was very funny because it was getting so complicated, but yeah, I'll try and send it across.
And it might maybe go back to your point before where you sort of keep it simple, don't have too many metrics, because the kind of the natural inclination is just to have as many because it looks better. Look how many things we're measuring, but most of them are just waste.
Yeah.
Andrew, if I can just comment, not a question. My portfolio has a lot of construction projects. And I just started looking at the flow metrics. I'm going to use your flow efficiency. You know, in construction, you kind of assume that it's going to take 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. It's like a given. You know, you're building a road or anything, but really the actual active time is really not there that much. But those kind of projects just take a very, very long time. So I'm going to share with you once I've done my initial analysis. I'm just hoping that I will have some very, very interesting, metrics coming out of it.
That would be very interesting because the flow efficiency, well, two things to say. One is that we just released last week or the week before, everything's last week, isn't it? We just released a few weeks ago a new value stream mapping toolkit that you can use to actually help carry out the process of understanding flow efficiency. But the reason I'm mentioning that is we have started getting requests from people to use that process also on the operational value stream as well as the development. So things like manufacturing, the manufacturing process is an operational value stream. Typically, we've thought about value stream mapping in SAFe as applied to the development value stream, but absolutely we can use it to measure just the processes you described and other operational processes as well. So I would love to see how that comes out. I would love to see it. What is your, can I put you on the spot and ask you what you think the flow efficiency percentage would be as a guess?
I think
and we'll see how close you
not
are.
more than 15 to 20%
Okay.
Okay. I think some of the approvals take 6 to 9 months. And it just to read a document cannot take that long. Right? But we just accept it. And yeah, I'm just trying to now challenge, like, why?
Yeah, that's great. Super.
Thanks, Andy. Question from Penny in Manila. We have PPM to measure predictability via PI objectives, and we have typical KPIs on feature throughput, feature cycle time, etc. But we can still get to a situation where a product release is delayed with costs going over budget. Does that mean maybe our PI objectives and KPIs are not aligned with what's important for releasing the product within target and budget? That's a big question, Penny.
So, I mean, I'll say a few things and hope that I touch on the intention of the question. I think we do recognize that in this new way of working, it is quite easy actually to get detached from release milestones. And I see that as well in the work that we do at Scaled Agile, in that PI objectives, of course, only span across a single PI. They only describe the commitment you're making across those 12 weeks. But actually the work that we're doing incrementally towards the larger release can sometimes get lost in those kind of incremental steps towards it. So I think there's a couple of things to say. I think number one is, release milestones are really critical, and any objective that actually contributes to the release milestone or has some deadline fixed on it should be stated clearly, and that should be one of the measures of the objective. If there's an objective that we need to deliver in the next 2 months because it's on the critical path for the release, we should make that clear as well. There's nothing wrong with making it very clear as to when the objectives are needed to be delivered to make sure we effectively deliver this release. And I think the challenge with the way we do objectives sometimes is the assumption is they're all just ready at the end of the PI. But obviously that's not the case. Some things need to be delivered in the first iteration, some in the next 2. And the other thing I would say that I think a lot of people don't do that we can do, which helps, is to monitor our objectives more closely throughout the PI. I see a lot of teams that create the objectives at the beginning, pick them up at the end, assess their predictability, then move on. If we're really good about this, we should be bringing our objectives up every iteration planning meeting. We should bring them up in the Scrum of Scrums. We should make sure we're tracking our progress across them throughout the PI, and then highlighting early whether we're actually slipping, of course, away from the things we need to be delivering. And the same goes with our program board. Are we actually hitting the milestones we have and the feature delivery dates? So I think it's about active tracking. And then the last thing I would say is, although we don't have release management described as an item on the big picture, implicitly, we're expecting that all organizations who have big releases to manage have a release management function of some kind that is meeting on some kind of cadence to actually make sure we're on track for delivering those. So I hope some of those things help. I don't know what you think, Em, if you've got some thoughts or ideas around that.
No, I think I absolutely echo what you say, Andy. I'm sitting here going, yep, tick, tick, tick. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely agree. Tenny's laughing at us. Thanks for the question, Tenny, and thanks for the answer, Andy. I'm gonna sneak one in because people ask me all the time. So OKRs made an appearance in SAFe when under that you can choose to write your strategic themes using the OKR format. And I can remember as that came in, I don't know what particular session it was in, but I was in some session with Dean where the question was asked OKRs and SAFe, and at that point in time, the message was very much, it's an interesting approach for writing strategic themes, but nothing necessarily beyond that was on the agenda. Meanwhile, the amount of questions I get about OKRs, I would say, is accelerating, even to the point that people are asking, does the OKR methodology fit with the SAFe methodology? So I'm just curious, Andy, where the current thinking is on that.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions as well. And we are starting some work at the moment to think about OKRs. I don't know if it's going to be an advanced topic article or what yet, but we are looking into this, and it's something I'm working on. Here's what we want to be careful of. So number one is we see the benefit of OKRs. Organizations like the clarity it gives. They like the work it does to help connect strategy to execution, to create real measurable outcomes. SAFe has always had objectives. SAFe has always had measurable objectives. They're not been known under the OKR terminology. And what we want to be careful of is we don't want to add a dual system here. We don't want people thinking about PI objectives, program PI objectives, strategic themes, and then on the other side, a whole set of OKRs as well, because suddenly that adds to the burden and the overhead. So what we're more thinking in is around the following. If organizations see value in the OKR format and using OKRs in the way it's described, we can certainly use them for strategic themes. We could even start using them to describe our team PI objectives. There's no reason you can't use the OKR format for teams to describe the work they're committing to and how that aligns to the strategy. So I think what you'll see in the future is a way for us to express the benefits of OKRs, but a way to express them which incorporates them naturally in the objectives that we have. Now, would I recommend writing iteration goals using the OKR format? Well, probably not. That's maybe a bit of a stretch. Would PI objectives fall nicely into it? Yeah, they really could. Strategic themes already do. Program PI objectives or solution PI objectives, absolutely they could. So I think that's the route you'll see us going down, rather than a separate system that sits alongside what we have today. But we recognize that people see real value in this, and there's real discipline in writing good OKRs. There is a practical side to this as well. If we recommend writing PI objectives as OKRs during PI planning, what does that look like? What does the sheet of 7 PI objectives look like with 3 to 5 measures on each one? Is it feasible? Is it helpful? Is it the opposite and actually becomes a very difficult activity? So we're just working through this at the moment. But I think you'll see something in the future. It is a hot topic, I agree. And then, of course, the other thing about OKRs is what does that do to the dual operating system? How do we balance OKRs across the hierarchy? We can use OKRs to drive things like personal development as well. So we're thinking about how those things also connect. Fewer objectives, yeah, could do, yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Once we have the OKR guidance, we'll invite you back for an update.
Yeah.
Folks, that brings us to the top of the hour. If anyone has one last question, I could probably manage to squeeze that in.
If you don't, I can say one last thing about the question that I get quite a lot, or at least one thing that resonates a lot, is perhaps one thing that resonates a lot was that last thing I said about people moving away from creating metrics that are roll up from the lower levels and realizing that actually metrics at each level need to be thought out very carefully independently. And it's not just about rolling things up from the team to the program to the portfolio. And that seems to be resonating really strongly and helping organizations get unstuck when at the portfolio level, they're looking at things like velocity, which is a roll up of 50, 100 teams, and it's really not helping them to be effective. So that was something that seems to be going down well.
Thank you so much for your time, Andy. Really appreciate you dropping in on us this morning before a full day of teaching. Really, you're very generous with your time. So thank you so much. I know everyone here really appreciates you doing that. And as always, folks, so good to see so many of you again, and look forward to seeing you around.